Task Force X, Baltic Sentry, swarms of undersea drones and subsea listening devices. NATO and the European Union are honing their defenses against grey zone activities targeting seabed infrastructure. And across the oceans in Asia, countries are coming together to address the growing threat to submarine cables. But how do you protect a global network spanning over 1.2 million kilometers? For a clearer picture on what is going on beneath the waves, we are joined from Abu Dhabi by Brendon J, who is an Associated Research Fellow with Stockholm's Institute for Security Development Policy, and in London, Katja Bego, who is a Senior Research Fellow with Chatham House's International Security Programme. Katja, NATO in January launched a mission called Baltic Sentry, with ships and planes patrolling the waters around the Baltic Sea. And then the European Union also is coordinating and has submarine cable infrastructure expert group. Can you tell me what they're looking into?
Yes, absolutely. So there's, I would say, some overlap, but quite clear distinction between both of them are doing, but both of this is really in response to some of these both kind of more increased potential sabotage incursions into the Baltic Sea, particularly on the side of NATO. And the EU plans a slightly longer line, because this is a topic that's been on the agenda for a while. And it's really about sort of bringing more resilience to the European cable network more generally. So this NATO mission that was launched really in response after the most recent incident, Christmas Day, with the Eagle S ship. It's got a mission called Baltic Sentry, and what that's really trying to do is basically be a lot more present in the Baltic Sea, show to any potential culprit or anyone who might have any bad intentions that this is an issue that NATO takes seriously, that these are infrastructures that they really care about, and it's effectively to deter any sort of such incidents, which is more, I'd say, on the naval side. It's of course something with military coordination. That's something that's really done by NATO in Europe, and then the EU does more of the, let's say, economic and policy interventions to help make coordination between countries a lot easier, to help hopefully also bring more redundancy and security into some of the networks. So it's maybe some of the, let's say, less glamorous interventions, but perhaps some of the ones that are probably even more high impact when it comes to actually protecting some of this infrastructure.
Brendon, we briefly talked about the Quad effort and the individual effort, but what are the vulnerabilities in this region? I think it's quite clear in Europe, because we've seen some very clear incidents of what's going on. But if we were to study this part of the region and the waters around the Asia Pacific, what are the vulnerabilities that security experts would be looking for?
Well, the biggest vulnerabilities are always accidental or environmental in nature. So there's lots of cable cuts each year, but this is generally done through accidents. So a fishing fleet dragging nets or anchors in an area where cables are, but it's unclear. This is, I believe, what happened in Vietnam a few years ago, or was part of the problem, or there's, earthquakes and other things. But security experts in geopolitics, if you will, when this gets involved, vulnerabilities are really where the front lines are in general. I think geographic proximity plays a big role here. So Taiwan, obviously, is the front line in the Indo-Pacific, as are Japan's Ryukyu Island chain, very close to Taiwan, and then Philippines, South China Sea, that area as well. In the research that I've done on this with some Japanese researchers as well, looking at both the Indian and Pacific Oceans, that geographic proximity and where China is and where China's ocean frontage is does mean the Pacific seems to be a little more vulnerable. However, should we see tensions really rise with India and China in the Himalayas, we could see more activity in the Bay of Bengal, for example. But right now, that seems a little less of an issue. Going back to the question about bathymetry and mapping of the seabed floors, part of this, at least the claim is made that the Chinese are doing so in order to allow underwater vehicles and submarines, frankly, to be able to move throughout the Indo-Pacific silently, secretly. And this, of course, means that there could be vulnerabilities as far afield as Australia, for example. So that's something to also keep an eye on.
And speaking of vehicles or movement on the seabed, Katja, NATO in February launched Task Force X. Can you explain what that is? Because I believe that that involves an army of sea drones.
Yeah, it is funny when you look at some of the NATO response, and I think this has some analogs actually in the Indo-Pacific as well, some of it under the kind of AUKUS umbrella, is that there's now a lot of attention as well could we maybe use drones or other sort of more, say, automated systems to monitor in particular the seabed. And the thinking is here that, like this is an enormous network. You could not viably monitor all of it at any one time, but just with Navy vessels, that maybe drones could be an answer. And this, of course, kind of coming off the back a little bit of the past few years, a lot more interest in drones, kind of proven success of drones in Ukraine and many other battlefields. As a little bit, I would say, as a panacea to maybe solve all of our problems. Like this is a way we can achieve really rapid scale, have a lot of things out there, and really show, basically do a lot more with less. Because some drones are a bit cheaper and don't need fewer people to organize such a thing. I think what's interesting about the drone question, or whether you could use drones for this kind of monitoring, is whether that's actually a viable thing. And I do see there's quite a bit of skepticism around that, because you could use aerial drones, so sort of typical flying drones that we know maybe to move to a ship that's maybe acting suspiciously, see what's going on. That's one thing. Which but the second thing that's getting quite a lot of investment now and interest is this idea of having actual underwater drones that work quite similarly. Problem there is that the technology for kind of underwater drones and things like that is still a lot less advanced than it is for aerial drones. So it's very difficult to, for example, communicate with an undersea drone back to the land and actually share some of that data, as it's much murkier and difficult, quite literally, to see what's going on. So I think it's an interesting area of innovation. It could be a solution for some of this in the future. But I'm personally a little bit skeptical that this is where we'll find the answer and kind of have the sort of silver bullet for really having a really clear picture of the seabed.
Right, and I want to bring up another concern. And Brendon, you kind of touched on it in the sense that only a few companies are laying these cables, making these cables, and repairing these cables. And U.S. officials are warning that over the involvement of Chinese companies in new global seabed projects, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, suggesting that they could now monitor data. How much of a concern is espionage through cables?
That's a great question, Divya. Espionage is huge. I think it's much bigger than sabotage, actually. It's which is interesting because the discourse really has been about sabotage. I think people fancifully have ideas of submarines with large scissors on the front of them, potentially cutting through these cables on the seabed floor. And of course, the cables have been around, as I mentioned, a long time. And one of the things the British in World War I back in 1914 realized is that they could cut cables, but they could also tap them. And so the espionage has been going on for a very long time as well. Friends spying on friends and rivals spying on rivals. And so that's really, I think, very, very critical. And as Katja mentioned, in the Baltic and everywhere, for that matter, these cables carry lots of commercial traffic, but also often carry certainly military and perhaps even more sensitive intelligence data. And so I imagine that governments, both on, say, the China side of the equation, as well as let's look at Quad, NATO, Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific lattice work of security architecture now, that these states are prioritizing counter-espionage in terms of those cables. So that's very, very important.
Katja, just to even the playing field here a little bit, how much of this conversation is happening in Europe about possible espionage and cable tapping, and concerns not only about China and Russia, but also about the U.S.?
I would say that some of these questions, and I agree with Brendon, are probably almost a bigger challenge also in terms of what it's meant for the future of the network, if you will, because I think, and this has really started in the Indo-Pacific, I'd say, but is spilling over to Europe and other places, is that question of whether if you can actually really trust the cables that are being laid, particularly if they maybe connect to places that actually have direct access to the traffic, if that makes sense. So it's less, though there is some speculation this could happen, that you could maybe put like listening devices on cables and things. That's probably technically very, very difficult. But where there's more concerned about is if you're the one where the cable lands, right? And that was indeed the case also for Britain in World War I, is that because so many of the cables landed in Britain, they were able to intercept some of that traffic. And that discussion exists today. I think a lot of that focus with the US being very concerned about new cables being laid with American investment involved, for example, that would land in Hong Kong or in China proper, and what that would mean for the integrity of that data. Similarly, some of that is now being discussed in Europe, also in the context, indeed, of China. Russia is not much of an actor in this space. But there is unfortunately a bit of precedent, of course, for this as well, with some of the US-owned cables that maybe land in the US, whether that traffic will necessarily continue to be safe into the future. I don't think that's perhaps as big of a concern. I think the discussion is very much focused on China as well. We've seen some initiatives being led by the US, actually involving a lot of European countries and other allies around, making sure that the full supply chain of a value chain, if you will, of the cables is secure. Like, so who's in charge of repairing the cables? Who's in charge of actually like laying them? These sort of questions, because those are the points where probably you can build in some of the technologies or things that would allow you to intercept some of the traffic rather than, like in situ when they're already out there on the seabed. That sort of thing we really, really do see happening. And I think that's another debate. It's perhaps a little bit less mature in Europe currently, but is evolving.
Brendon?
Yeah, so just talking about the new cables being built, right? A lot of this is funded by big tech, American companies, Google, Meta. This, after all, cables carry that's their lifeblood. That's their monetary value, and so it's information. So obviously they have a stake in seeing more cables built. But what's happening now, as you mentioned, is the cables are avoiding landfall in China. So preferring instead to have landfall, for example, across from the U.S. to Japan and then down to Taiwan and then on around through Southeast Asia, et cetera. One of the things this does raise, though, is fragmentation in the cable ecosystem, something we've been able to avoid for a very, very long time. And so that leads to this idea of walled off networks or national networks, or at least multinational, but only certain countries involved. And that might be self-defeating in some respects, because therefore it's very clear for an adversary which cables to cut and which not to cut, knowing that they won't be harmed and there won't be a boomerang effect. So Russia, for example, has talked about building a national network. I can't believe that's ever going to happen for a variety of reasons, but in some respects, it would probably be the best thing to happen in terms of Russia's rivals, if you will, because that would make cable sabotage quite straightforward. It's not straightforward right now, and I think this is a really important point to make, is that there is so much redundancy in the system, and it's built that way with different industry agreements, et cetera, so that we don't have latency, so that we don't have a slow internet, so that our communication financial transactions continue apace each and every day.
We're just about running out of time here, but being Taiwan Plus, I want to bring it back to Taiwan. Katja, Taiwan has had a number of cable incidents and also, as we mentioned, is being on the receiving end of China's gray zone warfare tactics. If there's one thing that Europe is doing that you feel Taiwan could benefit or learn from, what would that be in terms of cable security?
Actually, if I could turn it around, which I think is quite interesting, is maybe that actually Europe can learn a bit from Taiwan. And it's a discussion that's very much only now starting in Europe in quite the same degree of earnest, is to think of alternative technologies as well. So it's not the case that cables will not be replaced anytime soon. There is no other technology that can carry quite the same amount of data that can just in any way start to meet the kind of extraordinary bandwidth needs and kind of data needs of the global internet. But there are, of course, and we've seen some of this starting other technologies that could maybe at least serve as stopgaps during an incident. And I think here kind of some of these lower Earth orbit satellite systems, such as Starlink. And I think that in response to the earlier incident in 2023 that Taiwan really been investing quite a lot in it. Can there be backup systems that we can have in place that say if we did have a widespread outage or really some of those 15 cables, quite a large number were broken down, we really start to notice it kind of in our connectivity. Can we have some of the systems? A lot of that's been shown in Ukraine as well as quite effective, and a lot of digital infrastructure was destroyed there. And I think now European countries are really starting to look at what Taiwan's trying to do there, particularly also diversifying suppliers, and once again become very reliant on one single system, but have a diversity of options in the network. So when we think about redundancy, that it's not just about building more and more cables, but it's also about maybe having other technologies and other means of kind of having connectivity in place.
Brendon, Katja has touched on a lot of what Taiwan has been doing and what it is trying to do. But from your point of view, given that Taiwan is not party to a lot of the international groupings that are out there, how do you feel Taiwan could, in a sense, secure its cables better?
Well, even though it's not party to these, I think implicitly and tacitly it works very closely with its neighbors in the Indo-Pacific, with the exception of China. So, I mean, syncing up closer with Japan, Philippines, obviously the United States, these cable connections are intrinsic to all of these states here. And so thus being able to, for Taipei to be able to work seamlessly with Tokyo, Washington, Manila potentially, to have a single point of contact should something happen with these cables, that would be a first step. So I mentioned earlier, understanding each and every state's legal, regulatory, telco ecosystem, who does what vis-a-vis cables. That's a first step. And then finding that single point of contact or designating that and sharing it with your counterparts, like-minded counterparts in the region. That would probably be a second step to take.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Katja Bego from Chatham House in London and Brendon J from the Institute for Security Development Policy, speaking to us from Abu Dhabi. And for our viewers, what should your country do to defend its internet? Let us know in the comments below and click the video beside me for a look at the threats, sabotage, espionage, and other grey zone tactics posed to critical undersea infrastructure. And if you don't want to miss more stories on tech and business from Taiwan, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell.